Thank you very much for your kind welcome, and Mr. Brennan, for your kind words. Whenever I hear that in an introduction, that I am the first native Chicagoan, born and raised here, to become the Archbishop after an absence of 40 years, has been suggested to me that I'm also perhaps living evidence of the proposition that you can't go home again. But nonetheless, I am glad to be here, glad to be Archbishop of Chicago, and glad to be with all of you. I'm deeply honored by the work that the Lumen Christi Institute has done in order to create a forum around some of the theses of what is the purpose of my book, God in Action. I'm truly honored by the scholars who have come to comment on it, the three very distinguished scholars who have just been introduced to you, and to all of you for taking the time to come. What I'm going to talk about is a central thesis in the book, which is also of great cultural importance now, particularly since 9/11, the relationship between freedom and truth. It's a relatively simple argument, but it fits itself within the context of the purpose of the book, which is to talk about God, not about religion in public life. There are a lot of such books, but religion is about God, first of all. If it is reduced to a set of ideas, then it acts in public life through human actors exclusively who happen to hold those ideas as their personal faith. If it is treated that way, then religion is one more ideology in competition with others. At best, it is a philosophy of life. It is, however, in that case, a philosophy of life that even in those circumstances would try to say who God is. And there are various answers to that question. It is a public question because it makes a great deal of difference, doesn't it, to which God you worship or what kind of God you worship. A God who tells you to forgive your enemies, for example, or a God who tells you to get even with them is a very different God. And it has not only personal consequences, it has social consequences as well. So if, as I say in the preface, religion presents only a God who is at most a cosmological principle, a God of the gaps, as it's derisively and rightly derisively said, then it is science that shapes public life, and God, if he can't have a place in a scientific formula, doesn't have a place at all. If religion presents only a God who has no existence except as a projection that expresses the sum total of human yearnings, as the word was for John Dewey and for similar philosophies, then it's psychology that shapes public life. If religion presents only a God who looks like a nation's citizenry, then politics becomes the highest level of public conversation. And there's good evidence that God has traces of all of that, at least in the people who write to me. The other day I received a letter from a rather angry lady who claimed two things, and quote unquote, nobody tells Americans what to do, and secondly, God has told me that, and then she went on to tell me what I should believe. So I'm not sure how she puts those two together, but I will ask her politely in a follow-up letter to say, it's very interesting, how do you put these two together? Anyway, if God is a God rather who acts, who I believe has revealed himself as acting principally in Christ's passion and resurrection from the dead, then how do we trace that action in public life? There are lots of books. St. Ignatius of Loyola's Exercises is the most important one probably, or the most used, where you trace the actions of the Holy Spirit in an individual's life through reflection, through prayer, and come to a decision, this is what God is calling me to. And there are other far more important books about a theology of history where you kind of take a God's eye view of the sum total of human action, private and public, which will be revealed finally only at the Last Judgment, but nonetheless you give an insight into what you think is the way to organize our theological approach to God's action throughout all of human history. This is not so important in either way. It is a rather modest attempt to try to trace God's action. God is an actor. He's not just an idea, nor is he just a set of rules. God is an actor also in the events of public life, of social life. And how do we trace that? It's an attempt in a way of discerning a spirit, but doing it more philosophically and theologically than through personal reflection. So one of the theses, however, if we go back to ideas, is that the God who acts is a God who protects our freedom, who is not in competition with us because his level of causality is vastly different from ours. God's ways are not our ways. And he is omnipotent, but in such a way that he makes us free. He doesn't try to stop us from being free. It picks up, therefore, on Jesus' line in John 8, the truth shall make you free. God is a God of freedom. God is a God of truth. How do you put those two together? Jesus says, I am the way. So it's a way of acting and the truth. And evidently for Jesus there was no contradiction between truth and freedom. In fact, the truth does make us free. What does he mean? Well, philosophers tell us that there are two sorts of truth in most epistemological theories, the truth of correspondence and the truth of coherence. And I think basically what I want to say is that there's usually no problem when people ask or dismiss the idea of truth, particularly religious truth as a threat to personal freedom, that if you say, well, there is truth, isn't there, if you're looking for facts? I mean, there is a sense of a correspondence between what we know and what are the facts. What is the situation? What is the reality? People will say, yes, that's what we need precisely in order to act with some confidence. And so they will fight back against theories that say you don't really know what's out there. No, it's possible to know the truth. The legal system is set up to try to help us understand the facts around a particular action, which may or may not be against the law. Again and again, when we're buying things, etc., we want to know the facts because in a pragmatic culture, if you're going to be successful in your action, you better understand a situation in its factual detail. People understand that. And so you don't have many agnostics who say there is no such thing as truth at all. When you get to facts, they'll say, oh, all right, at least they can come close to corresponding to what the situation is, and we judge people by whether or not they have really worked to find the truth, the factual truth about something, or whether they've manipulated facts in such a way that not only are they insulting the hearer, but they're betraying the mind itself. The culturally sanctioned search for facts, just the facts, just give me the facts, is, however, important for establishing something about ourselves, something about the one who searches for the fact. And that isn't often attended to in the rather popular pragmatism which is behind our understanding of truth. And so I would like to spend a little bit of time to say that the search even for factual truth, truth just at that level of correspondence, is important because it tells us the dignity of the human person, of the knower. The understanding of oneself in knowing is not a new enterprise, certainly not original to me. It starts with the Greeks. And it's interesting that the encyclical by Pope John Paul II, as I think most of you would know, when he talked about the relationship, the dialogue between faith and reason, started not with a scriptural quote, it started with the Greek philosopher's admonition, nos te sauton, know yourselves. Now that was because he was an anthropologist, but he saw the connection immediately between what we are doing, no matter what the facts are, no matter what we're coming to know, but what are we doing in knowing the facts that tells us truly who we are? What's the truth about ourselves that we discover in knowing? So if you don't mind, since it is my book, I will read a couple of paragraphs from it, and because I think I say it better there than I can paraphrase it to you now. It's an argument I think almost all of you would be familiar with from the immanentism of human knowing. There resides at the very center of each human life a spiritual dynamism that does not follow the laws of physical motion and is therefore the source of both consciousness and freedom. Because if the laws of physical motion were involved in our knowing, we would not be free. They're not free. Unless Einstein was wrong, of course, as we've come to discuss now. That center of each human life deserves the name spirit. We are so familiar with our spiritual being that we easily overlook it or take it for granted. In our everyday life, however, the spiritual is readily at hand with a little self-conscious reflection on what we're doing in human discourse. Now, Suppose we are in conversation with a friend. We grow animated. We draw upon a certain store of physical energy. No matter how enthusiastic one becomes in conversation, one can't keep talking forever. Physical energy is expended. One senses a need to rest, to get some coffee. But in that conversation, something else is going on as well, even when we are unaware of it. We're coming to a truth about ourselves. Speaking with precision and attending to the proper character of the conversation is not at all a zero-sum physical translation, such as when I push a heavy weight or pull a car out of the mud. In these situations, I lose energy. There's a transfer of physical power from me to the object. In exchanging my ideas with others, however, I don't lose them. All of us engage in communication without any loss. The scholastic philosophers call this feature of knowing immanent, an activity that remains in the knower even as it passes into another knower. The wonder is that while it does remain in the speaker, it also becomes present to and in the friend with whom he or she is speaking, at least to the degree that the speaker has been clear and the friend has been attentive. This is the first law of the spiritual activity of knowing and communicating. It isn't subject to the laws of thermodynamics. It isn't technological. Human beings have been conversing for a long time. We are social animals, or in more contemporary terms, animals who speak. There is still more to be gleaned from this very ordinary activity of conversing with another human person, and in that discovering the truth about ourselves. Hegel, the great German philosopher, pointed out that consciousness has the capability of going out to the other, of identifying with the other, and returning to itself, all the while retaining its own identity without loss. In going out to the other and in recognizing it and understanding it on its own terms, no matter how superficial or partial our knowledge might be, the mind doesn't intrude upon the other. The other remains other. Even if they know the recipe for making pie, the recipe remains a recipe. Knowing is distinct from musing occurs only when we are present to the thing as it really is. Knowing is not reverie, it is attention to the object and on the object's own terms. Dreaming about pie won't feed me. I have to know the recipe. Our wonder is increased if we attend to what is going on in our own person. As I write, or as I'm speaking to you now, I know I have a relationship to the room in which I am writing. The last time I was here, I was first named Archbishop of Chicago, or the year after, in 1998 perhaps, and I gave a lecture on the relationship between American culture and faith. And there I said that there were two sources of American culture, Calvin and Hobbes. No reference to the cartoon exactly, but it was fortunate that there was there. But it was an interesting lecture, and I got a lot of response from the people who were there at the time. That's my memory of this room, and I find myself back in it again. The room is not a projection of my own consciousness. The room is the room. But I've had two experiences with it, and I hope this is as happy as the first. As I speak, I know I have a relationship to the room in which I'm speaking now, and the reader has a similar relationship to his or her room, if you've read my book, or any other. This relationship is different from the physical relationship by which the chair settles under one's weight, or we bump into tables if we're not careful while going for a coffee break. Too easily we think of our knowledge of the room as putting images and ideas in our heads. It's true that we retain residual images and ideas in memory once we've left the room. I had one of this chamber. But in actually knowing the room at the time we're in it, we don't put ideas in our heads as though we're placing pictures in a miniature art gallery. Our knowing of the room puts us into the room in a non-physical way, as far as our mind is concerned. I'm already in the room physically in my body, and I'm once again in the same room in my being aware of it. I'm doubly present in and to the room, in physical existence and in intentional existence, in knowledge. Insofar as we know the objects in this room in some fashion, we do not put them into our heads. They're there. On the contrary, we're cast into the room in a new and distinct and wondrous way. For insofar as we know the object, we don't bump into them, or upset tables, or press down on chairs, in ways that are going to leave us in physical trouble. Yet we are truly present to them, not just physically proximate to them. The wonder of knowing is that it's not governed by the justly famous three laws of physics. Rather, knowing is non-invasive to the thing known, and it comes about in us by our submitting to the way things really are in themselves. There's a correspondence between what the mind thinks and the actual factual situation. The truth of things governs our knowing them, and knowing them invites us and frees us to act. Now we know, and so we can make a decision based upon facts. You want to know what's going to happen to your pension fund? You'd better know the facts. They're out there. Even painful truth brings a certain enrichment because it enables us to know our situation truly. In the very center of the human person, therefore, at the spiritual source that is governed and perfected by truth, we come upon the secret of human freedom and the bond between freedom and truth. Truth has the power to convince us and to attract us. Truth opens us up to ourselves, to others, and to our world. Truth is the power that draws us out of this deadening passivity into the medium of genuinely spiritual existence and genuinely personal life, the life of freedom. That is why freedom cannot be divorced from truth and why we can't try to divorce them from each other in making the case for personal human dignity. Our dignity as persons has its roots in the freedom that images God, who is omnipotently free, and is brought to self-consciousness from natural reason and from responding to God's own gracious self-revelation in faith. This freedom lays upon us the adventure and responsibility of acting in accordance with the truth received, including the truth about human nature. Our moral actions originate in our freedom, by which we corroborate our nature or at war against it. Moral actions develop us as persons, they qualify our life. In that sense, to know the truth is itself a moral activity, and to lie is immoral and diminishes us and decreases our freedom. In a materialist schema which doesn't recognize the spirituality of knowing and the freedom of acting, problems in scientific and technological advances become acute, both morally and in the realm of truth itself. If freedom precedes knowing and giving, and is not intrinsically related to both, there is pure indetermination or indifference in assessing competing truth claims, and then there is no need to pursue the truth of the situation. There is need only to affirm oneself in this battle of opinions and conflicting physical forces so that one will survive and be able to make a certain difference in one's life on one's own terms. It's not a matter in a materialist philosophy of discovering oneself through looking for the truth of things and through generously giving oneself to this truth once discovered. It is a matter, rather, of discovering oneself through a willed self-affirmation that leads to a disordered desire for control over every aspect of human life, and therefore to warring against the human condition itself and to a resentment against it, which are spiritually destructive. Even the Greek myths often illustrate this battle, usually tragically. So, I've said people understand the relationship between truth and facts in the correspondence theory, and I'm saying in discovering facts, we discover the most important facts about ourselves, that we are free to act because we can know the truth of things. But there's more to it than that, because there is a second sense of truth, which also is not very often adverted to, and that is the coherence of all these facts coming together to create a story. How do all the facts fit together? What is the context for our knowing? Is there an adequate vision of reality, all of reality, or at least the reality in which we live and in which we have to find our freedom and move accurately, truthfully? One can get the facts right, and the story is still wrong, because they're interpreted in a context that comes from something other than reality, that is made up by the speaker in order to prove a story, drawing on facts that will fit the story and ignoring the other facts, because, in a way, they get in the way. So a coherent context that doesn't fit the story that had previously been determined determines then in its own way what is fact and what is not. And the other facts will be ignored, and only the facts supporting the story will be reported. Why is there so much unhappiness with the media at times? It's because sometimes the facts aren't right, but they're pretty careful about checking facts. But then when we finish reading it, we say, well, that might be the set of facts, but it's not true. There's something wrong. Here's what they didn't understand. Here's what they didn't get. Most of all, here's the context, the coherence of all those facts as they come together. We've all had that experience. What is reported and what is not. The Church in recent years has been particularly upset in many ways, rightly or wrongly, about stories that ignore a certain amount of facts, report some, in order to support the story that is in fact now popular in many ways. Most recent example was World Youth Day in Madrid in Spain. There were, at one point in front of the Pope, 1.5 million young people and several 100,000 outside the field because the police wouldn't let them in. To get 1.5 million young people gathered together around the Bishop of Rome is a fact, and it seems to me it might be of some importance, What was more moving for me being there was that the rain came down, everybody got soaked, the Pope cut short his remarks, but then he did something that this pontiff has introduced to the formula for World Youth Days. He brought out the Blessed Sacrament, where in Catholic faith Christ is really and truly present. He presented it to them, and they knelt in the mud for 20 minutes in silence. Now, this was 1.5 million kids who were cheering and screaming and yelling and singing songs, and greeting the Pope and all the rest. That you'd expect. 1.5 million kids, of course, are going to be noisy. They're teenagers and people in their 20s. 1.5 million kids kneeling in the mud in silence for 20 minutes is a rather important fact, it seems to me. But it denies the story that the church has nothing to say to young people, that the church is an aging and dying organization that is out of step with many, if not most, of the younger people of the world. To report that fact would falsify the story, so the fact is ignored. Now, that's my take on it. It could be that I'm not seeing it from their context, from why is this not news, but it was very moving for me. That's a case in point. You can bring up others. I'm sure all of you have had that experience. It's not a question of ill will on anyone's part necessarily, although it is sometimes when you read books. Bram Blanchard's book, for example, about American democracy and Catholic power that was popular in the 50s, took a lot of facts, rearranged them, and created a story that simply wasn't true, but was very, very persuasive to a lot of people. And we can say that about a lot of things. The church herself has perhaps done that at times. But it points to the fact that the major part of truth isn't just factual, nor is it just self-knowledge. It's also coherence. What are the myths, what are the stories that are going to make sense of the facts as you try to put them together? Now, there are many sources of this coherent vision that make sense of the facts. We can, for example, as political beings, as citizens of a state that was founded upon holding certain truths, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, find in that general vision a coherence that enables us to interpret the facts of our history as they come along, whether it's recession, whether it's war, whether it's celebration, whether it's the 4th of July. Whatever it is, it finds its place within a coherent vision that enables us to not just live immersed in the facts of that moment, but rather to lift ourselves out of it, to give ourselves hope, or perhaps maybe to issue a warning, because something about these facts doesn't quite cohere with the larger vision that gives meaning to our life as citizens, as political beings. But political values can't tell the whole story. They can't be the only or the ultimate coherent vision of things, important though they might be. If political values are ultimate, then of course the state is supreme. And we are in extreme difficulty if we hold that. So besides that, there are also philosophical sources of the vision. And they are extraordinarily important. They're not totally in agreement with one another. It's like Jean-Paul Sartre says, you tell me what you want to be told to do and I'll tell you which counselor to go to. So philosophical visions are something like that. You tell me whether you want a vision that's open to God or whether you don't, etc., and I'll tell you which philosophy to study. The big complaint about academic philosophy since 1952, when John Dewey died, who was very much concerned about coherence, about the total vision of things, the last great American philosopher to be so concerned, although we're getting back to it now. But academic philosophy became a meta-discipline. Didn't have any facts to look at except to criticize them, not to make them coherent, to examine their logical presuppositions and the rest. But it wasn't speaking to first-order questions. What is truth? What is freedom? Is there a God? Who are we? What is our destiny? Instead, in order to be a truly rigorous academic discipline, it adopted a methodology of analysis that was very useful in some ways. It's something like historical critical methodology being used as Holy Scripture. It's very useful in some ways, but if it takes away from that coherent vision of how God has created a salvation history, then of course it is a distraction, not a help. And sometimes academic philosophy in recent decades has been unable to present a coherent vision, is not a source for it, at least not popularly any longer. There was a time when men like Dewey would be called upon to make public statements because people recognized in him a secular voice for a coherent vision that may have been, he thought it was, compatible with the American coherent vision of politics and also with where he thought we were going to go. So, if, however, we want a vision of things that cannot become closed in upon itself, that cannot be ideological and destructive of human freedom, then I would argue, and it's an argument, that we must have a truth that comes to us from the source of truth, from God itself. The important thing about religious visions is that if they recognize a true God, then they cannot be closed systems, because the true God is always more. He escapes our understanding. We can understand truth about God. The Catholic Church in the First Vatican Council came to the defense of human reason against agnostics and said, no, reason is capable of knowing there is a God, not knowing the God who has revealed himself in Jesus Christ with very much accuracy, but they can know that a God exists. And here are some of the approaches to it. That human reason is capable of that means that human reason can never, to be true to itself, close in upon itself, because there's always more. And so it can't simply be an ideology. So the moment in which we are is one where we have to come back to that argument about the relationship between truth and freedom, which will eventually raise, of course, the God question. There's need to be humble in asserting any vision, but also clarity in exposing an inadequate vision. And we do that in dialogue, which is, of course, the great missiological challenge of the Second Vatican Council, the dialogue between faith and culture, dialogue between faith and reason, the dialogue among many faiths, the dialogue with other Christian churches in ecumenism. This is, of course, the challenge, and I hope that the book contributes to it. The truth completes and heals us. People generally start looking for truth if they feel there's something missing in their life, or if they feel they're suffering and they need healing. Then they start to go outside, well, who can do this? There are many actors who might say they're able, and each in its own field might be. There's only God, finally, at least from the viewpoint of perspective, who can come to a point, as we bring him into our lives, where he can help us come to that point where we can say, now I see. It all comes together. I knew who I am in relationship to all that is, and I'm therefore now free to act in a way that will not be destructive. The challenge now is to be allowed, of course, to speak religious truth publicly and to be permitted to act on it both personally and institutionally. Thank you very much.